Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everyone. Good to talk to you, Bill. I don't know, we're in late July, right? We haven't hit
We
August yet.
it's definitely July. That you got another good,
What month is
uh,
it?
at least 6 7 weeks
It's the
of
22nd.
heat wave risk. Yeah. So I imagine
Yeah,
Washington is still cleared out.
today's beautiful, but we had some heat index 105 type situation recently. But today's great. I drink hot coffee either way, though. I'll say that. It doesn't mean I won't drink some iced coffee, but I don't care if it's a million degrees. I can still drink hot coffee. It doesn't dissuade me.
You just need the caffeine, or you like the taste of coffee.
Well, I think it's that first you like the caffeine, and then maybe there's a Pavlovian sort of response or something where you end up associating the flavor with the coffee buzz that you get. So I guess now I like both, but I'm not the kind of guy who would get coffee flavored ice cream, if you know what I mean.
So I'm not really a coffee drinker, but coffee ice cream is delicious.
I don't even know how you function without coffee. Like I feel like if I swear this is true. If I could have gotten like a venti Starbucks at 1 o'clock when I was in high school, I feel like I would have probably gotten much better grades and been much more attentive. I don't know that I could do my job without coffee. Like I'm juiced in a sense that I'm using a performance enhancing
Well,
drug.
I don't need a pick me up in the morning. Um, I do find I tend to do a lot of writing at night now because when the kids are asleep, and I will need sugar fixes to keep myself going. Um, so I would like to say I am completely free of all addictions. But I do find myself get a little twitchy when it's 12:30 and I'm trying to get through a bit of writer's block. I just get stuck and I just have to go get a scrounge around the fridge or like dig out an old bottle of chocolate sauce and just guzzle it. Just something just to get me through.
Well, you got to do what you got to do, and these blog posts don't write themselves, Bill. These podcasts don't tape themselves. And speaking of podcasts, you can listen to this on a podcast or watch us if you want to see our beautiful faces.
A segue and a plug, Matt. You are the master.
That's right.
Now
It's
I'm
a
a little worried,
slug.
Matt. I'm worried that you're gonna have that your publisher is gonna demand that you rewrite your entire book to include Donald Trump on every page. How can you have a too dumb to fail book about the Republican Party stupidity and not have Donald Trump at the heart of it now?
Well, Trump was already in the book before this whole Trump movement started. Because he was when I was writing the book, he was sort of still flirting with running and stuff. But it's come to encapsulate the premise of the book. The Trump phenomenon demonstrates the problem that the right faces, and that the why I needed to write this book. But I don't. But I don't want to sort of rewrite it and direct it toward him, because then it has a really short shelf life, and this is a phenomenon that predates Trump, and I suspect will be going on long after he's gone. Um, I don't want to make the book about Trump, because I think then if Trump drops out in December,
Right.
then what do I do? And the book comes out in January.
Right. But I have seen this on the left too, that Trump is the monster that the Republican Party created. They've gone so long off of grievous and histrionics and wild, oversimplified, if not outright false charges. Now you have this all coming together in one carnival barking, blustery package, and the leadership knows that this is hurting the party's brand, and they can't contain it because they have fed their own base a similar form of that style of politics for so long. How can they now say this is somehow inherently detrimental?
Yeah, I mean, this is, who said you know, obviously it's from the Bible, but somebody recently talked about, you reap what you sow, and there's an element of truth to that. I mean, Trump sort of takes this phenomenon to a ridiculous level, and it's almost performance art, and you almost wonder whether this is all a joke, but it matters because people think it matters, and I think you have to take him seriously. And I'm urging today, Bill, and we'll see how this is received. I am urging Rush Limbaugh to assume a leadership role in policing the right, because I think he's honestly the only one person who has the juice that would be required.
But isn't he actively cheerleading Trump right now?
Not exactly. That there was a New York Times article that I think was a little misleading that that implied that Rush is, I would say, really having it both ways. He's not cheerleading Trump, but he's not in any way calling Trump out either.
Because Rush usually is of the mindset that Republicans should be as smash mouth as possible. We shouldn't be cowed by what the liberal media tells us how we should behave. We should, once they start scolding us, we should just push through and ignore it. And Trump seems to encapsulate that view. So how could Rush suddenly play the rational, responsible, demure role? It doesn't seem to be how he functions.
Well, I think there are a couple things there. One, you're right. It might be weird for Rush to turn on a dime and all of a sudden take on this leadership role as a sort of arbiter of what qualifies as legitimate conservatism. I wish he had done this a long time ago. It's funny because, in some ways, supposedly, and not supposedly, I mean, I think it's on record. I mean, Rush, Bill Buckley took him under his wing a little bit. I think they had dinner together. And I think in some ways, Rush sort of is the inheritor of the Bill Buckley throne. I mean, not at National Review, but just in terms of being kind of the de facto leader of the conservative movement. And it's kind of a shame that Rush hasn't risen to the occasion. Now, I think you're right. He does sort of fetishize fighting and likes people who tell it like it is and fight the left and fight the media. But he ought to also care about people who are, legitimately conservative. And Donald Trump's record and rhetoric not that long ago, it's pretty evident that he's not a real bona fide, sincere conservative. And so I think Rush could, on those grounds, speak out against him. Now, I remember, because I started listening to Rush somewhere around 1988, 1999, when he became syndicated and went national. And I feel like Rush has changed over the years. I'm sure I've changed too. I remember him being very hard on Ross Perot and defending George H.W. Bush. Now, that's a slightly different scenario. This was like, George H.W. Bush was the incumbent president, Republican, and Ross Perot was running as a third party.
Ross was pro-choice. Ross was anti-Iraq war. Ross was for raising taxes. There are lots of reasons why Rush would not want to get on that train.
But that's pretty much where Donald Trump has been within the last
that's where
5 years.
Has been. Trump has taken more liberal positions in the past. He's not running on those right now.
Well, okay, fair enough. I think that's true. And I think you're right that matters to some people. I don't think it should matter. I don't think we should be gullible enough to, just because someone's telling us what we want to hear today, believe that we can trust them to be president or whatever. All of a sudden trust them. I think people need to kind of prove themselves. By the way, there have been some people, Eric Erickson, Greg Gutfeld, others who have been speaking out. Not to mention Jonah Goldberg and George Will and Charles Krauthammer. I mean, I don't want to make it out to be that nobody on the right, but the talk radio folks in general, the Laura Ingrams, the Mark Levins, the Rush Limbaughs, and then, of course, the Ann Coulters of the world, who sort of represent this populist, grassroots, conservative base that Trump is appealing to, would have the moral authority. Somebody called me out for calling it moral, but they would have the gravitas to within that base to call him out, and I think that they should, and that would be an adults rising to the occasion. And they're not. They're not doing it.
But a lot of folks are. I mean, Krauthammer and Will and Jonah Goldberg. Those folks are doing that, right?
Yeah, they are. And Noah Rothman over at Commentary wrote a really good piece very recently about this. Obviously, I'm calling him out. But I think my argument is that there is basically, Trump was kind of on the ropes the other day after the McCain comments. After saying that he didn't ask God for forgiveness. He was a little bit on the ropes, and all of his Republican opponents were finally starting to throw elbows at him when many hadn't in the past. And I think then Limbaugh could have delivered the coup de grace had he weighed in and said, okay, folks, I've been giving Trump a long leash here, but he's not a real conservative. And Rush could have risen to the occasion, and I think that would have been a backbreaker. I'm not
for
saying,
all I know, Rush has said the same thing about John McCain in the past. I don't think that Trump was alone in mocking McCain's service on the right.
I don't know if Rush would go there. I would hope not. But somebody recently noted that Rush lives in Palm Beach, and somebody said on Twitter, Dan Coulter does too. I don't know if that's true, but Rush does live in Palm Beach, Florida. And of course, Donald Trump owns this really great, I've been there, it's called Mar-a-Lago, a hotel and restaurant. I probably won't be allowed to go to Mar-a-Lago in the future. But maybe Rush wants to be allowed to go to Mar-a-Lago. And maybe that's part of the reason. That's what one of my readers thinks anyway. But
you mentioned before, I mean, there are some pretty big names on the right that are calling out Trump, and that's not seemingly doing the trick. I mean, we're a little unsure how the McCain comments are playing. We've seen some, a couple of pollsters have said, well, we were polling Trump, and then on the last night, things dropped off, but there's a small sample size, so we can't really know. But then there was a Morning Consult poll that said that they didn't have that dynamic, that Trump's numbers stayed steady over the course of the controversy. So we haven't really seen a poll yet that covers an entire span after the weekend. But it would seem like all those voices are not being heeded by at least this faction of the Republican base. So why would Rush be any different? I mean, if you can't get Will and Krautheimer and Eric Erickson, all those folks, if combined they can't do the trick, how would Rush do the trick? I mean, are these people just resistant to being told what to do?
Well, it's funny because I recently, I'm trying to think of if it was you, I recently used the Godfather analogy on something, right? Where Vito Corleone says, it's true that I have these police in my hip pocket, but these police wouldn't be so friendly if I was involved in their narcotics trade, which they view as unseemly. I don't know if it was you or someone else I was having that discussion with, but essentially the premise there is that your fans are your fans as long as you do what your fans want, and the minute you quit doing what your fans don't like, then they won't be so friendly anymore. If you've seen The Godfather, that analogy may make sense. If you haven't, it probably will mean nothing to you and be very confusing. But the point is, you may be suggesting that Rush Limbaugh is at the mercy of his fans, and he may believe that too. I think that he is quite unique on the right, that he is what passes today for the one guy who can, if he were to use his influence, if he were to rise to the occasion and accept this role, that he is the one man who has the influence to persuade people, especially the kind of people who are supporting Trump. Now, number one, I don't have nearly the influence of Rush, but not only that, the type of people who read me aren't the type of people who would like Trump anyway. Let's be honest. I mean, the people who read me are not Trump folks. So I think Rush is really almost uniquely positioned, both because of his influence and because of his audience, that he could be the one person to really stand up to Trump. I think he could accomplish it. And I think let's, Rush maybe not as influential as he once was, but I think maybe if you take, and by the way, I say that about Krauthammer and Will also. I mean, Krauthammer and George Will are incredibly influential, but their fans, the people who care what Krauthammer and George Will think, are not the type of people who would be supporting Donald Trump anyway. So I think that for those reasons, Rush is kind of, it's like, help me, Rush Limbaugh, you're my only hope. He's like Obi-Wan at this point.
Well, what we do know after all this is people need to pre-order Matt Lewis's upcoming book, Too Dumb to Fail. Obviously, the Republican Party still needs it. They have not solved this problem yet, and it's almost unfair of you, Matt, that you are holding out on them and waiting until it's too late for your advice to save them. So I hope maybe they'll forgive you once the book comes out.
You could read my columns though, and get a. You may not get the. You'll still see through a glass darkly, but you will get a hint of the truth. That is my vision. If you were to go, I don't know, the Daily Beast today, you might find a column that I've written about Rush Limbaugh, or the Daily Caller. Let's say you might stumble across some wisdom. It is weird, Bill. You write a book, and there are moments. You spend a couple years sort of working on it, and there have been moments where I'm like, man, I'm glad the book isn't coming out now. Like a couple weeks ago, when there was all this political correctness, and I was really angry at the left, and so angry at the left, I was essentially willing to overlook all the flaws of the right. I was like, man, not only am I glad the book's not coming out now, but I almost wish I wasn't writing the book that I'm writing. I wish I could write a book about the left and the political correctness.
Didn't we already have 5 books on that came out last week?
But one more might do the trick. But now a week like this happens, or frankly the last month or so with Trump, and you're like, man, why isn't the book out today? Because this is exactly, and now I'm in this weird position of having my own perverse incentives of hoping that Donald Trump hoping that Rush ignores my advice and that Donald Trump stays in the game until my book comes out. So, it's a weird business that we find ourselves in. But this is the business we've chosen, Bill.
Well, now we often talk about fissures on the right because they tend to be above the surface. At least in probably wouldn't have said that 20 years ago, but that's often more the case today. But we did have some friction at the Netroots Nation conference over the weekend, where there was a presidential town hall, which Marin O'Malley and Bernie Sanders attended. It got taken over by protesters that are part of the Black Lives Matter movement. The way that O'Malley and Sanders handled it were not appreciated by those protesters at the time, but now you waited on this. You seem to say that the crack up on the left is occurring now. We've been focused so long on how the right can't get their act together. Aha! Now the left is going to fall apart. This proves it.
Well, this may be the beginning. I'm not saying that we're there yet, but what I am saying is that I think that that these things are cyclical, and it's hard. It's the same reason that like a football dynasty has a hard time repeating, let alone three-peating, because you need to have a winning coalition. You have to keep bringing in these sort of disparate actors who have in some cases conflicting or incompatible goals, and the coalition almost becomes unwieldy. And at some point after winning a couple of presidential elections, they start looking around and saying, well, what about us? When do I get mine? Or why am I? So eventually, it's almost axiomatic that eventually people quit playing nice and these schisms will emerge. And I think that the Democrats for a long, long time now, and by the way, I mean, the Democrats used to be really bad at this. I mean, it's just saying Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. I mean, that didn't come from nowhere. But in recent years, in the Obama era, the Democrats have fallen in line. They have been very disciplined by and large. And one gets the sense that that's beginning to become unfrayed.
Well, I would not overplay this as far as its political, electoral ramifications. And just so folks understand, there was a town hall. I believe it was supposed to be open to questions from the floor, but they didn't get to a lot of questions because there was a lot. One of the protesters jumped on stage. There was chanting in the hall. It took up a lot of time. O'Malley did the Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter line, which is greatly disliked in that movement because it's seen as glossing over the reason why the initial phrase came into being, that Black lives were not being valued as much, certainly by certain police officers, and that's the problem needs to be addressed. Therefore, when you start generalizing it, you're missing the point. And then when it was Bernie's turn and the chanting started, he was sort of seemed more dismissive. I'm not going to shout over you. I don't need to stay here. When he talked about his economic prescriptions, that did not go over well, and that has actually gotten more of the attention after the event than O'Malley's quote unquote gaffe. O'Malley actually then sort of did the rounds afterwards and did a lot of repenting and explaining himself and apologizing, and that seemed to take the sting off of him a little bit more, whereas Bernie didn't do any of that. He went off and did a 12,000 person rally in Phoenix. It's almost a way to say, I don't have to do that. I got this big crowd in front of me, and I'm on a roll. But there seems to be a disconnect in this corner of the progressive movement, or these few corners, whereas Bernie is out there with essentially a proposition that this populist economic critique has great political resonance across party lines. It's not just appealing to the far left. There are people in the middle and the right that also want to break up the big banks, that also are feeling the strains of economic inequality, that don't want to have their kids paying skyrocketing debt for colleges. And so he's out there on the hustings saying, let's test this proposition and see how well it plays. I did this in Vermont. Yes, Vermont is not a racially diverse state, but I was able to get a lot of rural and conservative votes in my earlier races when Vermont was not that deep a blue state with this model. And so when he gets asked about race questions, he then brings it back into an economic context. When I solve economic inequality through my jobs programs and whatnot, that's going to help resolve these other issues. Well, and the protesters are saying, weird too. I mean, that's not Bernie. True. Let me finish it up quick. The protesters are saying that's a false critique because if systematic racism is still dominant, the economic gains won't be fairly distributed. You need to talk about what you're going to do about institutional racism up front, and that should be your organizing principle. So that's where the two sides aren't really having a meeting of the minds.
All I would say is, I think Bernie Sanders was pretty active in the civil rights movement, has pretty good credentials. The fact that he would be booed down is amazing. And the fact that somebody, Martin O'Malley, would be shouted down for saying all lives matter is utterly radical. And I wonder why anybody would bother to go to Netroots Nation ever again.
Well, let me get into all that. But, your initial argument about Bernie, well, Bernie has the bona fides. He's been an activist for 50 years. He was in the civil rights movement in the 60s. Bernie's folks say that. And that sparked a backlash on what's known as Black Twitter with the hashtag Bernie's so black by joking about all the ways that Bernie is blacker than you. And some of the folks who have led that have said, look, we're not really... Our interest is not attacking Bernie. Our interest is attacking white liberal supporters of Bernie who want to justify everything that he does by saying, well, look what he did 50 years ago, when we're saying, what are you doing now? I don't care what you did 50 years ago. We're saying right now we want you to talk up front, not down the line, not obscured by the economic critique. We want you to prioritize the systematic racism argument.
This is where we've arrived, where you could march with Dr. King, you could endorse Jesse Jackson for president, and you could say Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, of course all lives matter, and that's not good enough. That makes you unacceptable, and not only that, we are going to deprive you from your right to speak. We're going to shout you down and not let you speak. I think it's indefensible, and I think it's horrible, and I don't think any presidential candidate should ever go to Netroots Nation again. If they cannot show respect for the people who are running for president who take the time to go there, I don't know why anybody would go.
Well, again. I don't want to put words in people's mouths. I did an interview with HuffPost Live that included, well, a roundtable, I should say, that included the main protester there and the host of the podcast This Week in Blackness, who's also a Netroots Nation organizer, and I made that point. I said, look, because I was asked, was Bernie the right target here? Why shouldn't people be focusing on Hillary more? And I said, well, it depends what the objective is. If your objective is to influence the Democratic Party platform, well, Bernie is certainly the wrong target. He's not really in charge of that. He's not the center of the Democratic Party establishment. He's unlikely to be the nominee. And now this episode allows Hillary to say, I was quite justified in skipping this conference because Bernie and O'Malley are getting in the teeth and I'm getting off scot-free. And if I'm another Democratic politician at the next one, you're certainly going to think twice about going again. So that might well, in the short run, diminish. I mean, Netroots Nation was premised on the notion that this blogger internet community on the left was influential, and the Democratic establishment needed to show up here and hear what these folks had to say, otherwise they would be worse off. And now those folks might say, you're not necessarily representing the entirety of the online sphere or the heart of the progressive movement. You're playing more on the fringe, and I don't need to go there. I'm much better off not going there and not listening to what you have to say. So there is certainly that risk there, but then I said, but if your concern is you don't like how the progressive movement is functioning, you don't like this drift or this push towards putting economics as the end all be all and putting the racism issue as sort of a subset of that, if you fundamentally disagree with that, then going after Bernie makes more sense because you're trying to push on that issue. And I said you might worth recognizing there might be some downside risk to that as far as short-term electoral prospects. But the response came back to me that if that's the way Democratic politicians are going to be, then maybe we don't want them to come to Netroots Nation. That's your choice if that's the kind of event that you want to run. But it comes down to what are you trying to get out of this whole operation. And the driving force seems to me, from what I'm hearing, what I'm reading, is that it's not about the candidates, it's not about the party platform, it's how the progressive movement is functioning. And that may well be, from my perspective, probably not all that impactful on the presidential race. I think this is happening in kind of a smaller corner of the political world. It's producing great discomfort among people in the progressive movement sphere. There's a lot of talking past each other and trying to figure out how do we get people on the same page. We want to talk about. I mean, it's not like white liberals don't want to talk about race. I hear white liberals talk about race all the time, but they're sort of talking about it.
They just don't have any. They just don't have any authority to talk about it. But
it's funny.
Here's the thing, though. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There was an interview done in the Washingtonian. I forget the guy's name. He did a mock documentary that was backed by Spike Lee called "The Confederate States of America," which is a satirical envisioning of what would happen if the Confederacy won. And he was asked about all this, and he went on to say that that he hates white liberals more than he hates rednecks because white liberals won't talk straight to you, and rednecks, they might hate you, but they're upfront. And he goes on to say that that he likes Rachel Dezenal. I forget how to pronounce her last name. I've already forgotten the whole story.
Dolezal.
You know, he was like, you know, she's like, she is more black than some of these other people. She at least was working with us and fighting for us, and you know, putting herself on the line.
I mean, like, your party, your movement, Bill. I mean, here's the thing. I spend a lot of time critiquing the right, but the loony left is unhinged and angry and mean, and I would argue much more dangerous than the radical right. And this is indicative of it. And I will say, I think the press doesn't cover it adequately. I mean, if this happened at CPAC, and I know it's not a perfect analogy, but if the second and third most popular Republican candidates for president were shouted off the stage at CPAC, I think the press would spend weeks covering it and talking about it. And I don't know that this has gotten the kind of attention that it really probably deserves.
Well, it's got some attention. It's not like it hasn't got any media coverage. I've certainly seen some. I think why it doesn't get as much as this might have happened at CPAC, and this is where you and I, one of the ways we part ways. I mean, look, both sides have elements that are, you know, farther to the left or right than, you know, where, you know, most of the presidential election gets decided. And I think the difference is that this faction of the left is far less relevant to Democratic office holders as it is on the right. I mean, you don't see the same level of intermingling with Democratic Party politicians as you do with these folks in the base as you do on the right. You know, people have to dance to, when Mitt Romney had to say self-deportation in the primary, something that he probably doesn't really believe. You know, that shows the deep pull that that the right has. You know, for Hillary to have to move from saying Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter to just saying Black Lives Matter, like, that's not. I mean, I realize that really gets under your skin, but that's not going to come back at her and hurt her in a general election. No one is going to say to you, "How dare you, Hillary, say Black Lives Matter and not say White Lives Matter right after that." It's not the same political risk that's putting the top nominees under. I think it's happening in a far more of an insular sphere.
Well, I think that interestingly, the conservative view of race, going back to Dr. King, a lot of conservatives who are sincere and who are not racists, and I think that's the vast majority of conservatives, really embrace Dr. King's message, which was very inclusive and it was for a colorblind society. And it seems like this is a departure from that. And by the way, that's no surprise. There have been many, many departures from that over the years.
Well, I think that's very much sorry, go on.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, like, I feel like what we would like to do is to transcend race and to talk about if there's a problem with the police, it's not, the problem is that the police are beating up people, are depriving people of civil rights, are too militarized. I'm totally willing to buy that. I don't care if the person's black or white. If they put somebody in the back of a vehicle and slam on the brakes, that's wrong, and the police should be held accountable and murdered for that. Irrelevant to me what color the person is. I want justice for the person who was injured, and I want the person responsible to be punished. And I think you start losing us when you start implying that white lives don't matter. Because I've got 2 white kids, and I want to live in a society where their lives do matter. But I think black lives matter too. But I guess I'm a racist.
I know that's the implication is that white lives aren't in danger, not that they don't matter.
Well, but I think that's number one. I think if you want to achieve a progressive agenda, you should be inclusive and assume that we're all in this together. And I think I have a stake in having a world where the police don't harass me or my kids. Now, the incidence of that happening may be much lower in the neighborhood I live in, or if you are driving while white instead of driving while black, but it still happens. And And if you're an African American trying to achieve goals, isn't it more prudent to actually be inclusive rather than exclusive?
Well, this is where things get complicated. I mean, I would say it is. I mean, I would say it's pretty broadly accepted on the left that strictly talking about these issues in a colorblind way all the time fails to actually get at the root of the problem. Obviously that is the end goal. The Martin Luther King vision of, content of your character is the goal at the end of the day. But there are certain things that if you don't talk about things more explicitly, you don't actually, you're not confronting things honestly. I think there are white liberals and black liberals that where that is generally accepted. Where you're getting where things are getting trickier, twofold. One, again, is this sort of divide between how do you integrate that into a broader progressive movement platform. What is your organizing principle? There's kind of like a jockeying going on, like sort of what is at the top of the pyramid and how you talk about things. And there's some inherent tension between how movement folks talk about it and how the politicians should talk about it. And there's a reason why Barack Obama is the first African-American president, because he was very deft in how he walked these lines, and he had thought about it for decades. And the More Perfect Union speech was a masterwork of navigating the minefield of racial politics, where he's talking about things in an explicit way, but he's also talking about things in an inclusive way. And he's had to walk a very delicate line throughout his entire presidency. He's been a little bit more pointed in the past year, but he has always been very mindful that if this starts getting talked about in a more us versus them kind of way, that's not going to fly.
Right. Well, I wonder if I were a progressive or a liberal, I wonder how I would react to this. Would my response be, I better get in line and start, using police my language and never dare say that white lives matter? Or would I be like, screw you, I marched with Dr. King, I endorsed Jesse Jackson for president, and now I might as well be, you get fitted for my Klan outfit. So screw you. I don't know how liberals are going to respond to that. It's particularly in certain parts
probably
of the
less
country.
Of the latter. I think that's
probably less. Well, certainly amongst, okay, if you're a political professional, you're in. So you may have to adapt to what's happening. But what if you're like a sort of a Jim Webb kind of guy out there, and you're not a politician?
Jim Webb's not gonna get many votes, so.
But you're not. No, I'm not talking about politicians. I'm saying, like, what if you're kind of a rank and file Democrat who was for civil rights, but in other words, is the left going too far? The radical left? Are they going to start alienating people who really ought to be or once were on their side?
I am sure there are older and whiter Democrats, particularly in certain states, that would really take offense to what some of the protesters are saying or interpret it in a very negative way. And look, in any coalition that's going to get 50% plus one is going to have elements in it that just don't easily get along. That's what big tents are like. But I do think you have Democratic politicians who probably are going to study very closely how Obama did it, and use that as a model to keep those tensions at a minimum. So this kind of blew up in Netroots. Netroots is not a Democratic convention floor, so I'm not convinced this is going to be deeply debilitating. It's something to keep an eye on. It's something to be careful about navigating, but I don't feel like this is enough evidence to say this is sort of the thread that's going to pull the whole thing apart. It's just the daily struggle of keeping coalitions together. I got to
Indeed.
leave.
Well,
I got to
all
leave in
right.
a little bit, Matt. But I wanted to do my share of self promotion today.
Please.
So I have a piece over at Real Clear Politics. There's a lot of talk about the Iran deal, and I've heard from several Republicans that Obama and of course Secretary of State Kerry, they should have walked away. There was a bad deal on the table, gave away too much to Iran, and you know who walked away? Ronald Reagan walked away. He walked away from the Reykjavik summit in Iceland in October of '86. He stormed out when Mikhail Gorbachev wouldn't drop his demand to relegate Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, what's also known as Star Wars. He wouldn't relegate that to laboratory research for 10 years. And Reagan said, this meeting is over, and he walked out. And then he stood up to the Soviets. He forced them to take a better deal. And Ken Edelman, in his book that came out last year, Reagan and Reykjavik, or 2 years ago, it was last year, said that was why the Soviet Union fell apart, because Reagan stood up on the SDI issue then and there, and that struck me as being a little too pat, and I went and refreshed myself what actually happened there. And two things about it that struck me as notable. One was that Reykjavik summit was just flat out weird. That was just one weird spectacle of history, where it wasn't meant to be a full-blown summit. It was supposed to be a 2-day thing where they prepped for a later summit. The Americans didn't come in with a bunch of proposals. They didn't think it was going to be a serious negotiation session. Gorbachev comes in with a whole bunch of proposals, a bunch of concessions. And we know now that Gorbachev he only been in power for a year at that point. He was very worried about the military arms race and the Reagan's buildup, that it was straining their budget. So he wanted to relieve that pressure. And so he was coming with concessions, some big concessions that would very greatly reduce their stockpiles. And the Reagan team's response to that was to kind of go a little batty and just sort of start one-upping each other, where why don't we eliminate all ballistic missiles? And Gorbachev would say, why don't we eliminate all offensive arms? And Reagan would say, we just eliminate all nuclear weapons. And Gorbachev would say, well, I'm fine with that. And there was no vetting of these ideas. This is all happening on the fly. So when the stuff leaked out afterwards, the Western European allies were like, Reagan, what are you doing? Why are you taking away our nukes that are protecting us from the Soviet Union? That's madness. But he did walk away over the SDI issue. Now, did that put the Soviets in their place? Well, the evidence actually says no. What happened after that, there was a period of time where they weren't really talking. And Iran-Contra started blowing up a month after Reykjavik. So Reagan was sort of looking for a fresh opportunity to get the talks back on track. Gorbachev's advisors were saying, this SDI thing, it's not going to work. It's going to be a big waste of money. Don't sweat this. And so then Gorbachev said in February of '87, forget SDI. Let's just do a treaty that eliminates the mid-range nuclear missiles. And the Reagan bill said, that sounds great. Let's go hammer out those details. And that came to be, the preliminary agreement happened in the fall of '87. They finalized it in December. Now, when that came out, this is the other part of the story that's really important. The conservatives at the time did not say, hooray, Ronald Reagan, you got a better deal. Good job for your negotiation strategy. They were livid. They thought this was a sellout. They thought they were so on the ropes, and Reagan was giving them a lifeline. They were not. William Buckley said this was unfair to Europe. It didn't take Europe's security into account. And Reagan had to say publicly that those who are objecting to the deal the most, deep down, believe that war is inevitable. Well, I think when there's an opportunity to strive for peace, you should strive for peace. It's the exact same argument that Obama is making today about the Iran deal. So I feel conservatives are going through a little bit of revisionist history of what happened in Reykjavik and accepting that actually Obama and Reagan walked down similar paths.
All right, so I'm not going to rebut what you said. We could get into a debate, but I won't do that. I will share two quick stories that I think are interesting. Number one, you mentioned Ken Edelman, who was, I think, National Security Advisor, and he was with Reagan at Reykjavik, and he wrote that book about it. I learned, because I interviewed him and I read the book, and I learned that, get this, not only was Edelman, whatever, not only was he with Reagan at Reykjavik, which is a huge historic moment, He was Muhammad Ali's interpreter in Zaire at the Rumble in the Jungle, which is just, it's almost like a Forrest
Right.
Gump type thing, right? The other, or Zelig or whatever. The other interesting thing is Lynn Nofziger, who was a Reagan aide and confidant, who had left the White House. I think it was before the Reykjavik summit. A lot of conservatives reached out to him, and they were afraid that Reagan was going to give away the farm, and that the old man wasn't up for negotiating with Gorbachev. And I think it was before Reykjavik that I'd have to go back and check, but I think it was when Nofziger met privately with Reagan, and Nofziger always said that was weird. You should never be allowed to just meet privately with the president. There should always be a couple people there with him. But he met with him, and he started to say, a lot of conservative leaders asked me to come talk to you, and Reagan stopped him and he said, "You don't have to worry about me giving away the farm. I still have the scars on my back from taking on the communists in Hollywood." And Nofziger said, "Well, that's good enough for me," and left. And you can find that book in Nofziger, which is the autobiography of Lynn Nofziger, which does not even mention the fact that he was in D-Day and lost his finger to Nazi shrapnel. But I recommend that book, Nofziger, and Edelman's Reagan at Reykjavik, if you're into this stuff. Fascinating. And Bill, I will. We may disagree on some of this, but I compliment you for elevating the discussion and bringing history into these discussions.
Well, thank you, sir. It's very interesting history. It's
indeed.
It's amazing that such an event even happened. But I think you can look back and say, Edelman has an argument that SDI, by holding ground on that put extra pressure on the Soviets, which eventually made them to overdo it on reforms and break up their union. And the counter argument to that is that they'd really gotten over SDI. I think there's definitely a fair argument that the prior military buildup put strain on the Soviet Union, and even if the INF treaty, the one I just talked about, relieved some of that pressure, there still was the pressure from before that was relevant, but that wasn't really SDI pressure. That was conventional arms and nuclear arms pressure. The fact that I think we can look back now and say, well, SDI, as Reagan envisioned it, never even happened. We have versions of missile defense now, but it's not the space-based stuff that Reagan was talking about. So, however you think about its relevance in history, it's the mere fact that Reagan went to the mat for something that 30 years later never came into fruition. It's just odd. It's odd that it all came down to that.
Indeed. So check it out, people. We report, you decide. Did Reagan end the Cold War by walking away from a bad deal and giving up Star Wars, or is that a revisionist history?
I didn't get into this, but I think it's also worth talking about. Should we have done more to keep Gorbachev around? Would we have Putin today if Gorbachev wasn't weakened by the forces that he unleashed, leading to Yeltsin, and Yeltsin handed it over to Putin? Bush. I got to read more about Bush's role in this. My understanding is that he was a bit more of a Gorbachev skeptic than Reagan was. Should he have propped him up more and prevented things from really disintegrating? That's a whole other discussion. I can't say that I fully researched it, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I just read a book and interviewed a guy. I think it's called The Last Empire, by, I think his name's Sergei Plotky. I'm looking it up right now. Yeah, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, Sergei Plotky. And I would highly recommend that book. And it's about that era, and the final days of the empire. And check that out. Or you can find, I interviewed him. If you look for Matt Lewis and what's it called? The Last Empire. But really interesting stuff. You should check that book out, Bill. You'd like it.
I will. All right.
All right.
I got Dash.
See you guys.
Always good to talk to you, sir.
Good talking to you, Bill, Scher, and we'll see you all next week.
All right.
Thanks.